So I'm really happy to have Dr. Paul Widerquist, professor of philosophy at Georgetown University in Qatar, specializing in distributive justice, which is the ethics of who gets what and why. He holds 2 doctorates, one in political theory from University of Oxford and another in economics. He's widely recognized for his work on basic income, and he has authored or co-authored 11 books, including A Critical Analysis of Basic Income Experiments and Independence, Propertylessness, and Basic Income. He co-founded the U.S. Basic Income Guarantee Network and served as co-chair of the Basic Income Earth Network. His academic interests span political philosophy, public policy, and social justice. Thanks for being with us, Dr. Paul. So we were hearing a lot lately about how artificial intelligence and automation will really displace a lot of jobs, and we're already seeing it with a lot of companies, laying off employees or kind of retraining and upskilling them for new jobs that may appear with artificial intelligence. And because of the work that's happening around AI and its progress, there has been a lot of talk about basic income being a solution for a lot of displaced jobs, with Elon Musk and other CEOs being proponents of it. So given your work in basic income and your long career in basic income, can you please take us through maybe some of its history, how it came about, and when do we really discuss it more often?
Yeah, well, people have been talking about basic income, at least on and off, at least as long ago as since the 1790s, when Thomas Spence and Thomas Paine, a well-known British American, Thomas Paine, was talking about something very much like basic income. A guy named Thomas Spence, who's a lesser-known figure, actually went and developed the first proposal that's a genuine basic income. Other people talked about it. Bertrand Russell talked about it in the 19-teens. It's come and gone. It's come and gone at various times. In the early 20th century, the teens, 20s, 30s, there were some people talking about it. It died down towards the end of World War II, when people came up with a solid model of how they were going to redefine the economic system at the end of World War II. But it came back in the 1960s, especially in the US and Canada, when people were talking about poverty and inequality again, and we're looking for a new model. But by the end of the 70s, when people were going towards vilifying the poor and talking about doing less, you've got politicians like Mulroney in Canada, Reagan in the United States, Thatcher in the United Kingdom, talking about just cutting the welfare system, and people who are more progressive were simply defending what we had instead of talking about how do we make what we have better. And it kind of fell out of the political discussion in the 80s and the 90s, but it came back in various spots and various places. There was a little bit of a wave of support in Denmark in the early 80s and in South Africa in the late 90s and early 2000s. And it's really taken off in the last about 15 years or so. It's taken off really around the world. So I call this sort of the third wave of the basic income movement. This is definitely the largest and the most international of all the waves of support that it's had. It begins gradually. It's hard to say when it begins, but you start to get some basic income experiments, one in Namibia in 2008, then in India in 2011. You have it on the ballot in the European, you at least have a ballot initiative in the European Union, and you get it on the ballot in Switzerland in the 20-teens. And with the protests that followed the Arab Spring and the Great Recession, you get a lot of progressive movements and people out on the streets and people talking about this. This is a new model. This is a way we want to go. It took off again in the United States with Andrew Yang's campaign for the 2020 election. He endorsed basic income and talked about it. And then with COVID, when we were telling workers stay home, it really took off because he's saying, well, if you're saying I can't work, how am I going to pay my bills? a lot of countries went with something like a temporary basic income, which really brought basic income back on the table. So now what we see from that pattern, we see it coming and going. It seems to come when people are concerned with poverty and inequality, or one or the other, or both, and are looking for a new model of how to do it. In the 1930s, with the Great Depression, people were looking at different things. In the 1960s, when they were talking about a war on poverty, people were looking for a new model. And in the wake of the Great Recession and a lot of other turmoil that's happened in the last 15 years, you get people talking about a new model. Now, it tends to go away either when people are less concerned about poverty and inequality, or when they distract people's attention off blaming something else. What's been happening in the last 5 to 10 years is that you get a lot of far-right politicians who are blaming all of our problems on foreigners and immigrants. I don't think foreigners or immigrants are to blame for really any of our problems. But if you can get enough people to believe that, you can get people focused on kicking people out of the country instead of actually building better programs that will make the country a better place. And this is sometimes this sort of a strategy has been successful in turning people's attention away from not just basic income, but really lots of progressive social policies.
Thanks for that. And so for basic income, there are a lot of people who are against and a lot of people who are for basic income. People who are for basic income are individuals actually like Elon Musk, who has said that no job will be needed and only people who just want to work for fun can work. But then again, that's also a question: do companies need people to work if they can automate everything and make bigger profits? One of the, I would say, reasons for, the disadvantages, I would say, of basic income, and that we've been hearing and people saying, is that it could be costly. So who's going to bear that cost? Is it corporations who are automating jobs and laying people off, or is it governments? And if it's governments, how are they going to pay for that?
Well, the U.S. and Canadian economies have both doubled in size over the last 40 years. But over the last 50 years, really since about the mid-1970s, wages and incomes of the median worker, of the typical worker, of really the 90 or maybe 95, even 99%, have not risen with economic growth. From the 1930s until the 1970s, there was a solid correlation where wages were going up with economic growth, and sometimes even a little faster with profits coming down. But since then, since the 70s, our income, the income of the vast majority of people, has been basically stagnant. It's gone up a few percent in 40, 50 years, while the income of the people in the top 1% has gone through the roof, has doubled and doubled and doubled again. And so this tiny group is getting a much larger share of what our economy produces, not because they're doing better things than they were in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s when they built the car industry and the rail industry and the airplane industry and the beginnings of the computer industry. It's simply because the rules have changed to be more favorable to people who are already very privileged. Well, we need to change those rules back. Part of that has to do with getting money out of politics so the government isn't just buying anything that firms want to sell. This is where Elon Musk gets most of his money, is that he spends campaign contributions on Capitol Hill, then Capitol Hill goes and authorizes buying things through SpaceX and other Elon Musk companies. That's the way to get rich in the world today, is to convince governments to buy what you're selling. So there's that aspect to it. And then we're buying more and more from the wealthy, our governments are, and we're taxing them less and less and less. We've redistributed the burden of taxation from the top 1% and the top 10% down to the bottom 99% of people. So there's plenty of money to go around. We simply need to change the tax burden back to something like what it was in the 1950s and 1960s. If you do that, there's plenty of money for a basic income. When you do that, when you create a basic income by discouraging the consumption of the rich in order to make it possible for the low-income people to consume more without kicking off inflation, you also give people at the bottom and the middle labor market power to command better wages. So when you see first the redistribution by taxing the rich and having a basic income for everyone, then you get a second redistribution as people have more power to command better wages, better working conditions, shorter work hours, more vacation time. That can lead to a better world for everyone.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. You know, it's interesting because a lot of economies are really, I would say right now, competing for investments from the biggest companies. And the way to do that is really to have very favorable tax schemes, lower tax so that they can bring in those companies and bring in jobs. And a lot of times they say, the reason why the wealthy don't get taxed as much is because, they're taking the risk, they're entrepreneurs, and that should be rewarded and to motivate people. But then again, I guess to your point is like, where do we draw that line to make sure as well that the population has some consumer power? Because I think what I've been struggling with and kind of an understanding is if people, don't have jobs and can't buy anything, well, these companies that survive based on that consumer ability to buy things is no longer going to exist. So then who's going to be the buyer, right? I'm wondering now I know there has been few pilots of basic income in certain regions, and what has been, the preliminary outcomes or if it has been done for a long time, what have been the long-term outcomes of having a basic income scheme around the world or in some regions in the world?
Well, there is no country that has a true basic income right now. You have the closest thing in the world that exists to a basic income right now is Alaska's permanent fund dividend, where what they do is when they sell oil, they take a very small amount of the revenue they get from selling oil. They put it into a fund. Then they take the returns on that fund and they distribute a dividend equally to everyone who qualifies as an Alaska resident based on those dividends. So it's twice removed from oil revenues, but it is originally based on their oil revenues very indirectly. That's the closest thing we have to a basic income, but it's very small. We're looking at $2,000-3,000 a year per person, which when you think about a family of 5 that's on the margins of poverty, that's going to make a huge difference. Mm-hmm. But it's not the type of basic income we want to talk about. The closest things that you might want to, some of the other closest things are when you look at the Nordic welfare systems, which are mostly conditional, but the conditions are less strict than in most other countries, and the amount that they redistribute are much more generous. And so you're getting less strict and more generous. You're moving closer to the basic income model. You're not there, but you're moving closer to it. The closest thing in all of those, in the Nordic countries, I believe, is the Norwegian pension system. Norway has a citizen's pension, which is funded also indirectly out of oil revenues, because Norway has a lot of oil exports. And what they use that money to create a fund like Alaska does. It's something like 10 times the size of Alaska's fund. And then they take the returns off that fund to fund a pension for every Norwegian over a certain age. So that's like a basic income for the elderly. And what you find in these countries that have things that are a little closer to basic income, you get lower poverty, you get happier people, and you get higher wages. You get more trust in society, with people trusting each other, because when you're in need, the government's not treating you like some criminal that needs to be tested to see if they're worthy to get some redistribution. They simply help people. When you do that, you create better trust, you get lower crime, you get more life satisfaction, you get higher wages, and things simply tend to go better in countries that are doing this sort of strategy.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.